1,000 subscribers isn't just a number to us, it's proof that stories like this still matter. Hit subscribe. A fishing family in the eastern mountains of Arabia carries a genetic signature that, on paper, belongs somewhere else entirely. Not somewhere close, somewhere across 2 seas and a continent. Researchers testing the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed from father to son largely unchanged, like a name repeated down a family line for thousands of years, found that in one cluster of tribal villages, wedged between a mountain range and a warm coastal sea, nearly half the men tested carry a lineage called R1B1A2A-L23. This is not a minor detail. R1B1A2A-L23 is one of the most heavily studied Y chromosome lineages on the planet, and its heaviest concentrations sit in Ireland, in the Basque Country of northern Spain, in western France. It is, statistically, one of the signatures of Atlantic Europe. 40 kilometers away, in neighboring tribal communities along the same coastline, that lineage almost disappears. Different villages, different mountains, same peninsula, a completely different genetic story. This is Fujairah, one of the 7 emirates of the United Arab Emirates. And before anyone dismisses this as a statistical fluke or a quirk of a small sample, it's worth understanding what's actually at stake here. In much of the Arabian Peninsula, ancestry isn't an abstraction. It's called nasab, a formal, spoken, often memorized genealogy that ties a person to a tribe to a confederation to a place in history. Bloodline is identity here in a very literal, very structural sense. So when geneticists find a Y chromosome signature more at home in Dublin or the Pyrenees commanding nearly half the men of an Arabian mountain tribe, they're not just filling in a curiosity, they're pulling on a thread that the entire architecture of tribal identity assumes is solid. How does a Y chromosome signature more at home in Dublin or the Pyrenees end up commanding nearly half the men of an Arabian mountain tribe? And what does that mean for who the Emirati actually descended from? Before that anomaly, there's the story every Emirati is raised on, and for the most part, it's true. The story goes like this. Emirati tribes trace their descent through nasab, oral genealogies passed down with the same seriousness other cultures reserve for written law, back to the great tribal confederations of the Arabian Peninsula. Bani Yas, Al-Bu-Falah, Al-Qawasim, Nakbiyin, Sharqiyin. Arabian tribal tradition splits nearly every lineage into one of 2 root branches, Qahtani, tracing back to ancient South Arabia and Yemen, or Adnani, tracing back to the tribes of the north. Most Emirati genealogies claim one branch or the other, a family tree with 2 possible trunks and 1,000 documented limbs. Layered onto that genealogy is migration. Tradition holds that the destruction of the Marib Dam in Yemen, conventionally dated to around the 6th century, sent waves of southern Arabian tribes moving north and east, into the Gulf Coast, into the folds of the Hajar Mountains, into exactly the territory that includes modern Fujairah. Layered onto that migration is an economy. For centuries, before oil, this coastline lived on pearl diving. The Gulf pearl banks were among the richest deposits on Earth, driving an entire maritime economy until Japan's cultured pearl industry collapsed that market in the 1920s and 1930s. Alongside fishing, date palm oasis farming. Alongside farming, overland caravan trade threading the peninsula together. Layered onto that economy is politics. The Trucial States era, from the 19th century into the early 20th, under British maritime treaties. Rule by sheikhly families. Unification in 1971, into a single federation, the United Arab Emirates. And underneath all of it, binding desert tribes and mountain tribes and coastal tribes into one shared identity, is language and faith. The Arabization of the region across the medieval Islamic period, which turned genuinely distinct populations into what the world now simply calls Arab. Then, in 1959, oil was struck onshore in Abu Dhabi, and the entire trajectory of the population changed again, almost overnight. It's a clean story. Genealogy, migration, economy, unification. One people, one bloodline, one national identity, built on a documented family tree. But that tidy single bloodline story rests on an assumption nobody had actually tested at scale, that the 7 emirates were always genetically one people. And when geneticists finally sequenced the tribes in enough detail to check, the emirates didn't map onto each other. They mapped onto 7 different genetic neighborhoods. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2022, a team led by researchers including Catherine Elliott, published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution, in partnership with Oxford University's Nuffield Department of Medicine and Emirati collaborators, built the most detailed genetic map of the UAE ever assembled. The scale alone is worth stating plainly. 1,198 individuals, genotyped across 1.7 million genetic markers, spanning 5 of the 7 emirates. Dubai and Ajman were excluded only because their sample sizes were too small to analyze with confidence. The headline finding was not a single Emirati genome. It was partition. Sharp, measurable, emirate level, and in places, tribe level, differences in the lineages carried down the paternal line through the Y chromosome and down the maternal line through mitochondrial DNA. The small loop of genetic material passed only from mother to child, like a second, quieter family record running underneath the one everyone recites out loud. Fujairah is where that partition becomes almost impossible to explain away. Restated with precision, 45% of Y chromosomes sampled in Fujairah carry the R1B1A2A-L23 lineage, a haplogroup that is, elsewhere in the Middle East, essentially a rounding error. Meanwhile, a subclade called J1A2B2A1, found in 18% of men sampled elsewhere in the UAE and considered a core Middle Eastern signature, is completely absent in Fujairah. Not rare. Absent. And Fujairah isn't the only outlier. In Ras Al Khaimah, 2 separate tribes show a predominance of haplogroup E1B1B2A-M123 against a regional baseline of just 5 to 8%. In Abu Dhabi, 1 tribe carries the T1A1A1A1A-P77 subclade in 55% of its men, 21 of 38 people sampled, against that same 5 to 8% regional baseline. 3 emirates, 3 unrelated anomalies, 3 tribal populations sitting well outside what typical is supposed to look like. Then there's the maternal layer. Mitochondrial haplogroup L, a signature associated with sub-Saharan Africa, appears at roughly 15% frequency across Emirati samples, nearly double what earlier research, including work by Al-Jazmi and colleagues, had estimated. A deep, consistent African maternal contribution, running quietly underneath the paternal Middle Eastern signal the whole time. Not confirmed, not resolved. Consistent. Here's the recalibration this data forces. The one Bedouin people consensus from a few minutes ago wasn't wrong about culture. It wasn't wrong about genealogy, or language, or shared history. It was incomplete about biology, endogamy, marriage within the tribe, and consanguinity, particularly first-cousin marriage, common and culturally supported across the region, didn't blend outlier lineages like Fujairah's R1B1A2A-L2S23 into the wider population over the generations. It preserved them, concentrated them. Some of these tribes are, genetically speaking, walled gardens sitting inside a shared national identity. Cousins who married cousins for enough generations that whatever genetic anomaly walked in the door centuries ago never diluted. It just got louder. So where did a lineage that geneticists associate with Atlantic Europe actually come from? And is European even the right word for it? The first serious explanation researchers reach for isn't about Europe at all. It's about something much older. The first theory says this population was in Arabia long before Europe, as a genetic category, meant anything at all. Population geneticists studying the deep history of R1b have increasingly traced its oldest, most ancestral branches not to Western Europe, but to Western Asia, the Caucasus, Iran, Anatolia. Under this view, the lineage now stereotyped as Irish or Basque only became associated with Europe after the Yamnaya steppe expansion swept westward roughly 5,000 years ago, carrying one downstream branch of it into the continent that eventually claimed it as its own. If that timeline holds, a population in the Hajar Mountains carrying a deep branch of R1BL23 wouldn't need to have arrived from Europe at all. It could represent a much older layer, a relic population from the early Neolithic, or earlier, preserved by the same geographic isolation that later preserved it culturally. Mountains on one side, sea on the other, and a tribal marriage structure that kept the bloodline contained rather than blended. There's paleoclimate research that makes this more than speculation. During certain humid interglacial periods, researchers refer to this as Green Arabia. The peninsula was not the desert it is today. It was a habitable green corridor, capable of supporting human populations moving between Africa and the rest of Eurasia, long before later desertification created the arid landscape most people now picture when they think of Arabia. Michael Petraglia, a co-author on the 2022 Emirati genome study and one of the most cited researchers on early human dispersals across the Arabian Peninsula, has built much of his career establishing exactly this: that Arabia was not a barrier populations skirted around, but a corridor they moved through, again and again, across tens of thousands of years. It's a compelling theory. Researchers are careful, though, to frame it as probability, not certainty, because the theory has a hole in it large enough to drive the rest of this story through. No ancient DNA has yet been recovered and dated from Fujairah itself. The 45% figure comes entirely from living people, tested in the present day. Without ancient genomes pulled from burial sites in the region, ancient substrate remains an inference built backward from modern data. A reasonable guess, not a confirmed timeline. And the window this theory needs is enormous. The relevant Green Arabia humid periods run from roughly 130,000 to 75,000 years ago, with shorter, later pulses around 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. A span that wide can make almost any old lineage's presence plausible, which is exactly the problem. A theory flexible enough to explain everything is a theory that has, in a sense, explained nothing precisely. An ancient substrate explanation is elegant. It's also convenient. It lets this story stay safely ancient, safely out of living memory, safely away from anything anyone alive today would need to reckon with. But there's a second, far more complicated explanation. One that drags this mystery out of prehistory entirely, out of Green Arabia and Neolithic back migrations, and into ships' logs, trade ledgers, and colonial forts standing on the Emirati coast itself. It doesn't need tens of thousands of years. It needs a few centuries and a handful of ships. The second theory starts not with Green Arabia, but with Portugal. For roughly 130 years, from 1507 into the mid-1600s, Portuguese forces controlled the key ports along the Hormuz to Gulf corridor, including Julfar, the historic port near what is now Ras Al Khaimah, sitting almost on top of the Fujairah coastline. Garrisons, trading posts, ships that didn't just pass through but stayed, season after season, for generations. Later, a second wave of contact layers on top of the first. The Trucial States era, roughly the 1820s through 1971, when British treaty ports, naval patrols, and resident agents kept a foreign presence anchored on this same stretch of coast for another century and a half. Under this theory, the R1b L23 lineage isn't a relic of deep prehistory at all. It's a signature of documented history. Sailors, garrison soldiers, or traders who stayed, married in, and left a genetic footprint that a strongly endogamous population didn't dilute over time, but concentrated. The way a dye doesn't fade in a small, still pool the way it would in a moving river. Here's the number that should make you sit up. 130 to 150 years of Portuguese presence is not a long time, genetically speaking. For a lineage to climb from a handful of founding men to 45% of a tribal population in that window requires an extraordinary rate of concentration. The kind of founder effect that demands a very small starting population and very little outside marriage diluting it afterward. It's possible. It's also a stretch. And there's real precedent for coastal contact leaving exactly this kind of mark. Research on Gulf-adjacent populations, including work by Lasso Jadart and colleagues published in 2017 on Bantu and Balak admixture along the Arabian Sea coast, has documented measurable African genetic input tied directly to the era of Indian Ocean sea trade and the historic Omani Maritime Empire. That study focused on the Makran coast, not Fujairah specifically, but it proves something important on its own. Recent, historically dated contact absolutely can and does leave a detectable genetic signature in this exact region. The mechanism is real. Whether it's the mechanism here is still an open question. Here's the part the records don't explain. Run the math on both theories side by side and neither one comes out clean. A lineage doesn't sit invisible in a population for tens of thousands of years without leaving some trace somewhere else nearby. And Green Arabia's ancient corridor should, in theory, have scattered this signature more widely across the peninsula, not concentrated it in one mountain cluster. But a lineage also doesn't leap to near-majority frequency in a population within a few centuries of contact without an improbably tight founder bottleneck. Ancient substrate is too slow to explain the concentration. Recent contact is too fast to explain the isolation. Both theories are plausible, neither one is proven, and that gap, the space between too slow and too fast, is exactly where the real answer is hiding. Before that answer arrives, it's worth remembering that R1b isn't the only unexpected signal sitting in Emirati blood. There's an entire second layer of ancestry, carried down the maternal line, that tells an even stranger story about how this coastline actually worked. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud without hedging every sentence, isn't really about where one lineage came from. It's about what belonging ever meant on this coastline in the first place. Mitochondrial DNA, the small loop of genetic material passed only from mother to child down through the generations, like a second, quieter ledger running underneath the family record everyone recites out loud, tells a different story from the Y chromosome. Across Emirati samples, haplogroup L, a signature strongly associated with sub-Saharan Africa, shows up at roughly 15% frequency. That number lines up with centuries of Indian Ocean and Red Sea maritime trade, including historically documented slave trade routes that moved people from East Africa's Swahili coast into Arabian ports over hundreds of years. Layer in a further signal, haplogroups more common in South Asia, plausibly tied to generations of divers, sailors, and laborers drawn from across the Arabian Sea into the region's pearling economy. Under this framing, there may never have been one founding contact event at all. Some UAE population genetics research has floated something closer to a merry-go-round model. Coastal populations rotating in and out of Gulf ports for over 1,000 years of pearl, copper, and spice trade, with no single arrival, no single ship, no single ancestor to point to. Under that model, the Fujairah R1b anomaly wouldn't be a mystery with one solution. It would be the most visible fragment of a much larger, much harder to trace pattern. One repeated, in smaller and quieter ways, in nearly every tribe along this coast. Researchers are careful to frame this as an interpretive model, not a settled finding. The data supports the pattern, but it resists a clean date, a clean origin point, a single moment anyone could point to and say, here, this is where it started. Imagine standing on a Fujairah beach before oil, before air conditioning, before the country even had its current name. It's the height of Gaus al-Kabir, the great summer pearling season, and the dhows have been out for weeks. Divers go under with nothing but a nose clip and a rope, sometimes 50, 60 times a day, surfacing with a basket of oysters and blood in their ears from the pressure. Ruptured eardrums are common, so are shark encounters. So is the slow, grinding damage of decompression that no one on that boat has a name for yet, only a body that hurts more each season. The economics of this world are as brutal as the physical toll. Captains and financiers, the Nokada and the Tawash, run debt cycles that bind entire families to the trade across generations. A debt inherited like a name. This is the economy that built the coastline's fortunes for centuries, until it didn't. In the late 1920s and through the 1930s, Japan's cultured pearl industry, Mikimoto's laboratories learning to grow what the Gulf had only ever found, flooded world markets with a cheaper, more reliable product, and the Trucial Coast's pearling economy collapsed within a matter of years. Roughly 3 decades would pass before oil revenue arrived to replace it. 3 decades where an entire coastline had to reinvent how it survived. And on those same boats, in those same coastal souks, across those same punishing pearling seasons, sailors and divers and traders from East Africa, from Persia, from Baluchistan, from India, moved in and out of Emirati family lines, season after season, generation after generation. What modern researchers are reading in a genome today isn't an abstraction. It's the pearling economy's family tree, written in a language nobody thought to check until 2022. Here is the detail that undoes the entire premise this story opened with. The cold open asked how a lineage geneticists associate with Atlantic Europe ended up commanding an Arabian mountain tribe. But R1b-L23 was never a European lineage to begin with. That's the twist. Its oldest, deepest branches, the ones population geneticists consider ancestral to everything downstream, sit in Western Asia, the Caucasus, Iran, Anatolia. It only became European, the way most people think of it, after the Yamnaya steppe migrations, roughly 5,000 years ago, carried one branch of it westward into the continent that has claimed it ever since. Not by years, by an entire direction of travel. Which means the mystery this video opened with was pointed the wrong way. This was never a story about European DNA arriving in Arabia. It may be closer to the opposite, a Western Asian lineage that this region may have hosted continuously, one branch of which migrated west and eventually became what the world now calls European, while another branch simply never left a homeland it was never really a visitor to. Run that reframe back through everything already on the table. The endogamy that preserved Fujairah's outlier lineage instead of diluting it. The math that made both the ancient substrate theory and the colonial contact theory equally strained. Both of those threads point at the same underlying truth. Middle Eastern DNA and European DNA are modern conveniences, categories drawn on top of a much older, much more continuous, far messier map of human movement across Western Eurasia. A map that was never divided the way the names on our maps today suggest. And Fujairah isn't the only place this pattern shows up. In Ras Al Khaimah, the E1B1B1B2A M123 haplogroup dominates two tribes far past its regional baseline. In Abu Dhabi, one tribe carries the T1A1, A1A1A, P77 subclade in 55% of its men, against a baseline of just 5 to 8% elsewhere. 3 Emirates. 3 separate anomalies, the same underlying mechanism each time. A small founding group, a marriage structure that kept outsiders out and insiders in, and a rare lineage amplified instead of erased. Which means the Emirati genome researchers set out to define in 2022 was arguably never one thing to find. One geneticist working on Emirati population structure has described conversations with tribal elders where this news lands not as an insult to identity, but as an expansion of it. An elder in Fujairah, on hearing that his tribe's blood carries a signature scientists can trace to the Caucasus and beyond, reportedly said something close to, "Our family was always older than the stories we tell about it." For a culture where nasab carries real legal and social weight, that's not erasure. It's a correction to the timeline, proof that Emirati identity was never built on one clean bloodline so much as on a shared history of controlling, surviving, and thriving at one of the most heavily trafficked crossroads on Earth. Zoom out from Fujairah's mountains, and this stops being a story about one tribe at all. Every population studied at this level of resolution turns up the same underlying pattern. Apparent unity sitting on top of fragmented, uneven, historically contingent layers of migration, isolation, and contact that no oral genealogy was ever built to record. The Emirati case is only unusually visible because its culture of endogamy did something rare. Instead of blending these fragments away over the centuries, it preserved them, sharp-edged, waiting for a genotyping chip powerful enough to notice. None of this erases the genealogies, the tribal names, the nasab, recited at weddings and funerals and formal introductions for 1,000 years. Those remain real, as social fact and lived history, regardless of what a Y chromosome says underneath them. What's changed is the picture underneath the picture. Researchers still don't know, precisely, when the Fujairah lineage arrived, or whether it reflects an ancient population that never left, a documented colonial contact, or centuries of quiet, repeated, multi-directional trade along a coastline that never stopped moving. The case remains genuinely open in the scientific literature, not a mystery anyone has solved, only one that keeps getting larger the closer it's examined. Think of it less like a single bloodline, and more like a palimpsest, a page scraped clean and written over so many times that the oldest layers of ink never fully disappear. They just wait under the newer script for the right light to reveal them. Every tribe on this coast is a page like that. Every genome is another layer surfacing. The Emirati were never who we thought. Not one bloodline, but a coastline's worth of them still being read.